thank you all for your patience. Sorry we held you in the waiting room for a bit. I just want to, I'm going to skip some of our opening comments. I just want to let you know who I am. I'm Caro Roselle. I'm our Education Director. I am here with Mel Gadd, who has been keeping bees for 15 years. He has been involved with the Essex County Beekeepers Association as a bee school teacher and a member of the Board of Directors. He maintains over 20 hives at home, local schools, and at Drumlin Farm, where he has founded educational programs on beekeeping as a part of the farm's educational mission. And Mel is, of course, also a regular presenter with NOFA conferences, and we're so glad that he's here with us tonight and that we were able to sort out our technical issues. So very, very glad to see you all, and I think we'll just jump right in. Does that sound okay with you, Mel?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. Folks, just so you know, you are welcome to ask, drop questions into the chat throughout tonight, and we'll pause Mel to sort of ask them in little batches. And then pending time at the end, we may invite you to come off mute for a discussion. So do feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and Mel, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, again, everybody, I'm sorry. It took us a little while to get my technical skills back up. But I'm basically going to talk about how climate change has impacted the bees, the pollinators, agriculture, and how it's impacting us. As Carolyn said, I run a major beekeeping program at Drumlin Farm, which is a Mass Audubon Society facility. We now have roughly 18 hives out there that are spread out around the farm. I've given talks at NOFA number of times in the past about how when we added the bees to the farm that their production has gone up by 20%, just because we're almost guaranteeing that everything is getting pollinated. But we are starting to have problems with climate change, as everybody else is. So I'm just going to run through this PowerPoint that has a lot of information. I posted a handout on, I guess it's the website. It's a PDF. It's not the whole presentation because there are a lot of pictures in here. But I posted.
I'll get that out to everybody just so you know. I'm going to upload that right now and send you a link. So just look for a link to that handout in the chat.
So that handout has a lot of detailed information, a lot of resources, and websites that you can go to get further information to help you along with your farming and dealing with some of these climate change issues. So this just goes through the outline of what I'm going to talk about. Talks about the impact on agricultural production in the US and worldwide, what climate change is and its impact, the beneficiaries of honeybees, pollinators, and beekeeping, and why they're so important to farming and us in general. The climate changes that are impacting the pollinators, and I use our experience at Mass Audubon for some examples, and what we can do to protect them. And then there's a little section on how we can get involved, that we need to really push the political world into changing the things that are really causing climate change. Okay. Here's our friend, the honeybee. Honeybees are the original immigrants to this country. It's probably why we're not getting much help out of Washington these days. They basically pollinate. They make sure that the plants that we all plant are producing food and seeds for all of us. They're very friendly. They're not going to really bother you unless you bother them. They're very focused. I think they're probably smarter than we are, but I'm not going to get into that too much. All right, what's climate change? As we all know, the climate has been increasingly getting hotter. The last few weeks here is a perfect example. We've also had changes in rainfall, heat waves, floods, droughts, and how it's really impacting everything. Our last 4 winters in New England have really been much warmer than they've ever been in recorded history of temperature development. And that's really having a major impact on agriculture, the fisheries, forest management, even urban development, and the pollinators. This is just a small number of what the impact of pollinators are worldwide on agriculture. It really shows how important the pollinators are from a financial standpoint. This is the amount roughly that pollinators create for agriculture in the US. And as all of you know, it's a major impact on our economy and our lives. This chart really goes through what effects climate change has on the insects and the other pollinators. Honeybees aren't the only pollinators. There are like 5,000 different types of native bees in the US, probably 300 to 400 in the New England region. They also pollinate, and in effect, native bees are better pollinators than our honeybees. It's just that we're not able to manage them and really increase their numbers. Honeybees, we're able to manage and increase the numbers. So on a scale, there are a lot more honeybees out there than the native bees. Native bees are much better pollinators though. Most of them are specialists. There are blueberry bees that pollinate blueberries. There are squash bees that pollinate the squash. Bumblebees are really important because they're the ones who really pollinate the tomato. But the change in the weather and the effects of that are really affecting the way the insects are being born and going out there and how the plants are growing. And it just ripples down. And I believe this chart is in the handout. I'm not going to go through each one, but I think you get the point that climate change is just a ripple effect down through everything. It's affecting rainfall, temperature, seasonality. We're having more extreme weather events. 3 years ago, we had the worst drought in the New England region that's ever been recorded. And that's happening regionally and globally. Some of the countries overseas are having worse problems than we are so far, but we're getting there. And it's affecting all of nature, all of the organisms, and us. The left-hand side of the chart just talks about what normal greenhouse, natural greenhouse effects are, and what the right-hand side really talks about, as I'm looking at it, what we're causing through all of our greenhouse gases that we truly have to change. That, you know, Washington thinks this is all fallacy, okay? Winters up here are changing drastically and all over the world. We don't get as much snow. The mountain areas where a lot of the reservoirs that service the Boston area and Cambridge and everything within 128, they're just not getting the kind of snowpack that the reservoirs require for runoff. And that is going to slowly affect us. Water is already an issue in parts of the country, and it's going to start to be a big issue in our part of the country. We don't see as much rain. We don't see as much snow. Sometimes when we get the rain, we're getting really impacted, but it's just not as much as we used to at all. And that's going to have a major effect on how farmers are working. This just goes through trends, how the country is warming up. New England's warming up from what it used to be. And this really shows how the winters are just warmer. And that has a major effect on the bees, which I'll talk about in a little bit. This just shows winter warming since since 1970. Our temperatures have risen considerably on average. Timing is everything. In the future, if climate change continues and we don't change our ways and we don't really start to affect it, we're going to have increased uncertainty about our weather patterns. There'll be more extreme weather events. There'll be localized cooling, desertification, more frequent droughts. Again, 3 years ago, we had the worst droughts up here ever. And at the rate this summer is going, it doesn't look like we're going to get the level of rain, inches of rain that on average we used to get. And the changes in the weather are affecting the timing of the seasons. Used to be we would get a hard frost in New England in late September. The last 2 to 3 years, we have not had a late frost in general until late October or early November. And that really has a major effect on our pollinators. It may increase some production on some farms because they can plant for longer periods, but the pollinators are getting kind of wiped out. So if I use this metaphor, and I'm going to read it, where bees are hungry customers at a buffet style restaurant, and flowers are the food items that need to be eaten. The bees can come to the buffet 3 times a day, brunch, lunch, and dinner. One day the restaurant opens for breakfast a couple of hours earlier than usual because warmer morning temperatures confuse the owner's sense of time. As a result, the bees arrive at the time they normally come because that's when they, in effect, wake up, and they miss breakfast. Means foods get tossed out and the bees are hungry and some of them die. The bottom line of this, what it's trying to say is, as the historic relationship between the growth of plants and the starting of plants and when the bees and other pollinators come out is changing, they've been synchronized for so many years, that synchronization is not happening anymore. And that's timing of these events is called phenology. And not the plants, unfortunately, and the pollinators aren't synchronizing anymore. So plants are, because it's warmer, they're blooming earlier, but the pollinators are not out in numbers yet. And so that the plants are not getting as pollinated, and the pollinators are losing food sources because by the time they're out and laying their eggs and coming through, the plants have already passed that point. And so the pollinating is gone or is less. Failure for plants to mate. There's this mismatch, again, between the pollinators and the plants because of the change in the weather. Early season plants can't sustain pollinators so that they're around for the later season plants. And they're just not synchronizing anymore. And that really will become a major problem for all of us. In parts of China where they have lost their pollinators, their bees and all their other pollinators because of pollution and climate change, they have people out there hand pollinating their plants. I'm not sure that will ever be able to be done in this country. It's not going to work. Honey production has decreased in the last 20 years and continues to decrease. The number of commercial beekeepers, the ones who take their hives around the country from farm to farm, the bigger farms mostly, they're disappearing. Oops, sorry. And that's becoming a problem. We can't get as many young people to get into the business of beekeeping. And not that I'm recommending big commercial beekeepers who move their hives around the country. For my preference, farmers should each start their own beekeeping program so that the bees are there and not moving around because of the problems that that creates. Honeybees and all the pollinators obviously pollinate 35 to 40% of the crops, period. And 84% of cultivated plant species are pollinated by, again, the honeybees and other pollinators. And so you can understand how important they are to all of us. One example I can give is there's a community farm in Newton. They used to have bees. Some beekeeper used to keep his bees on the property. He decided not to do that anymore. There were no bees on the property. The impact on that particular farm is, using one vegetable as an example, is his zucchinis and squash were much smaller after they didn't have honeybees on the property for pollination. So that also impacts us. Again, the bottom part just talks about how important financially the pollinators are. Honeybees, besides pollinating, produce honey, wax, royal jelly, and propolis. I'm not going to really talk about each of those, but they're valuable commodities that beekeepers are able to develop some money on. Here are some of the girls. As most of you probably know, majority of the bees in the hive are female. It's a female-run society. They do a better job. Maybe we all in the country need to take a lesson from that. What's better for the pollinators because of climate change? Large monoculture or polyculture? Monoculture, the big commercial farms that do one crop, I call clear-cut farming. They go in and they clear everything out. Most of the small-scale farmers, like NOFA members, Drumlin Farm, do a wide diversity of plants and wildflowers and weeds. The weeds are even actually good for some of the weeds are good for the pollinators. But these big farmers go in and wipe everything out and they plant one crop, which really doesn't help the survival of the bees that are brought in. And it really decreases the overall production in the long run. Average temperatures, this is just about Illinois and the Midwest, are increasing so that Illinois, Chicago area, their temperatures are rising due to the higher emissions, and their winters are not going to be as cold as it used to be. And again, that impacts everything. Again, the honeybees are the chief pollinators, and they're worth a lot of money for the production of food in the world. This is just one report that was done in England about how bees are under siege from habitat loss, climate change, and pesticides. I mean, there are a lot of things that are affecting the loss of the bees and the other pollinators. Climate change is one of them. It's probably second after pesticides and insecticides. And the decrease in the amount of farmland in the country. That really is causing problems. Just for people who don't know, this is the 3 types of bees in our beehives. Mom is in the middle, the queen, one queen. The drones are males. They have one purpose and one purpose only, to go out and mate with virgin queens. The majority of the bees in the hive are worker bees who are female, who do everything. They run the show. Queen really doesn't run the show. The worker bees do. Again, the impact, I think everybody really gets it. That as climate gets warmer, it's also increasing the problems that the bees and other pollinators have. Bees already have a problem with something called a viral mite. And as the weather warms up more and more, these parasites and pathogens are just increasing. And the impact on the birds and other animals in the forest and in our world is also being negatively impacted. I saw something the other day that they're projecting polar bears will disappear in another 20 years if things continue the way they are. And again, pesticides and fungicides and herbicides are really problematic. And how that impacts everything, and medically is probably impacting us. So habitat loss, temperature shifts, and diseases are all causing the problems. Climate change is impacting all of these. Unfortunately, some of the negative insects that are causing problems for the bees, like the warmer weather. I'm sure everybody has heard about this new killer beetle from Japan that's coming over from Japan that they found in the state of Washington. It's kind of freaking out beekeepers around the country. The Washington state is trying to stop the spread. Who knows? We're doing a little research at Drumlin Farm related to how to deal with them if they show up. I've started raising praying mantises who apparently will attack them and eat them. So we're trying to increase the number of, hopefully increase the number of praying mantises in general that are out there to help with that problem. But the warmer it is, the more problems we end up with. Our native bees are really being affected. There are already a number of bumblebees that are on the endangered species list while we still have an endangered species list. Just the weather is just wiping them out. No less the insecticides and some of the other poisons that are being put out there. And bumblebees and the other native bees don't have beekeepers to help them, though some of us are trying.
Mel, may I pause you for an audience question?
Sure.
Awesome. So Patrick is wondering to have flower continuity across all seasons to ensure pollinator continuity. Is there a specific pollinator plant seed mix available commercially?
Yes, and there are, I think in the handout, it lists a number of types of mixes where you're getting flower growth throughout the whole season so that there's still a source. There's also a movement to create pathways through states and areas so that there's what's happened with farmland being taken away and people building houses and developments is that it used to be that there was a continuous path of flowers for the bees and other pollinators to just move through, and that's disappeared. And now there's a movement to try and recreate those pollinator pathways. Actually, on the highways, I don't know if they're doing it anymore because I'm sure the federal government's not funding it any longer. They started planting, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, they've started planting wildflower plants in the middle, in the median strips. And that's one way to give the pollinators a continuous pathway that they need. And we need to do more of that. I hope that answers the question. There are some companies that are making wildflower mixes, and those mixes, if anybody knows anything about wildflowers, they will have different flowers blooming throughout the whole growing season and even into the fall. which is what we recommend. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the system seasons are creating, you know, the mistiming of when the emergence of the bees, which I talked about a little bit, and how that's not out of sync with when the plants are coming up. So that has a problem. There's greater risk for diseases. And even the plant scent due to the temperature changes affecting the ability for bees and the other pollinators to find the flowers. They actually do use smell, and that smell is changing with the weather's changes. Okay. This is a little video about a researcher who does research on the wild bees. So hopefully this will play. Does everybody see this?
I've captured a Bombus appositus queen. She was crawling on the ground, and she actually looks like a new queen that was produced this year. And so it looks like the colony.
Oops, sorry.
24 in Marriage Meadow. She looks so beautiful and new. You can kind of see through here. There's no wing wear on her. And so she looks like a brand new individual. Let me just let her go.
So that's a type of bumblebee.
Most of us, when we think of bees, we think of our big charismatic bees like bumblebees that are beautiful and hairy, or honeybees. But there's, 30,000 bee species at least globally, and those are extremely important as well. The general global estimate is that about 90% of our flowering plants require insects or other types of animals to transfer pollen. And bees globally are the most important pollinator. All of our favorite fruits require pollination: apples, blueberries, raspberries, strawberries. So there's a global concern that pollinators are in decline. And especially some of our most efficient pollinators like bumblebees, many of them are in decline. That has severe consequences for the production of food. So one of the ways that climate change could be affecting bee populations is by altering their phenology. And so phenology is the timing of when something occurs. With climate change, we're seeing earlier snowmelt timing. What that means is when the snow melts earlier, flowers are going to emerge earlier and they're going to bloom earlier. What we don't really understand is whether the bees are also going to follow suit. Plants need the bees to transfer pollen from one flower to the next. Bees need the plants because they want to eat the nectar and the pollen. And so our concern is that if climate change is altering plant phenology, and if it's altering bee phenology at different rates, we could have a situation where plants are available, but bees are not active. That's going to be a problem for both parties.
We've pinned about 4,500 bees so far this year. And so far in the entire project, I think we're on, what is it? Oh, we're on 25,000. Yeah, a lot of pinning, a lot of bees.
In most of the research that's been done on phenology, a lot of it has been comparing historical records to contemporary records. What has happened? We're asking or trying to project what's going to happen in the future. We have plots where we go in April or May and we actually shovel the snow.
This plot right here, this is where we remove snow from.
this yellow plant right here, Potentilla, started blooming earlier, and so it reached peak bloom earlier.
We're trying to force plants to flower earlier than they naturally would. But what we're not doing is manipulating the bees to fly at an earlier time period. And so we're trying to create a phenological mismatch between plants and pollinators. What we then ask is, given that we've created that phenological change in the plants, do they experience any differences in terms of their interactions with pollinators?
I'm going to go observe bees. Bombus appositus worker on Potentilla. Now it's flying.
If our plants start to flower earlier and earlier, what impact is that going to have on flowering plants and their pollinators?
Now it's flying, and it's out of the plot.
Our ultimate metric for how plants are doing are how many fruits they're making and how many seeds they're making. Once the fruits are ready, we go out and collect a subset of those fruits. We count them, and then we count the seeds in each fruit. So what we're saying with this climate change scenario is if plants flower at an earlier flowering time, the bees are not emerging at an earlier flowering time, will our flowering plants be in trouble? If we had to try and do what bees do on a daily basis, if we had to come out here and hand pollinate all of our native plants and our agricultural plants, there's physically no way we could do it. And so our best bet is to conserve our native bees.
So this really brings home the point about how climate change truly is affecting how our bees and pollinators are mismatched now with the plants. Whoops, sorry about that. Oops. Okay, so this is a produce section showing with bees and with pollinators. I have to admit, this is a Whole Foods, who has been very supportive of pollination work. Though with all the trouble that Whole Foods has been having lately about how they're treating their workers, I kind of took Whole Foods' name off. But, whoops. And this is what happens when the pollinators disappear or decrease. This is what happens to our produce sections. We lose a lot of our produce. Which is really, again, what's going to happen if climate change is not gotten under control. So I'm going to run through a little bit about what's happened, what we've seen out at Mass Audubon so far, considering that things haven't been that bad yet, but they're getting there. Mass Audubon has like 150 acres roughly, I believe, or 250. Of that, I think 100 acres are farmland. The rest are sanctuary and walking areas. This is just shows how a map showing how we have our hives distributed around the farm to ensure equal time for all the plants that are out there. And that seems to have worked. This is just a couple of our experimental hives. We also do a lot of research on natural approaches to dealing with the problems that the bees have with certain other insects and viruses. I think I've given a couple of talks at NOFA about using mushrooms and other mycelium to work with the bees and how it really has helped decrease their viral loads and help us with getting rid of some of these mite problems. So again, the warm wind, everybody assumes that the bees do better in the warm winters. It's really counterintuitive. The warmer winters are really bad for the bees. And the last 2 to 3 years, we have had much warmer winters. What beekeepers hope for is that you at least get a couple of warm days during the winter. Bees are very sanitary. They won't go out. They won't go to the bathroom in the hive. So they look for 45 or 50-degree days to go flying out. You'll find yellow spots all over the snow, and then they come back. The problem now is that we're getting winter days in January and February and even in December where we're getting stretches of 50 to 60 degree weather. And that confuses the bees and they go flying out. They basically, the warmer it is during the winter, the more they eat in the hive. When we teach beekeeping up here, we always said people need to leave 60 to 80 pounds of honey in the hive for the bees to get through the winter, and then we capture the rest. An average hive in a good year will produce somewhere between 200 and 250 pounds of honey. We're now telling people because of climate change and these warmer winters that they really need to leave 100 pounds of honey in the hive. So right away that decreases the amount of honey that we're able to take from the hive, which, you know, changes the bottom line for a small farmer. The bees also go fly, they fuel up with with honey, and they go flying out looking for flowers and never find them and never make it back because they run out of fuel and they die. So that's become a problem out at the farm that we're trying to somehow address. Also that because we're not getting hard frosts in late September like we used to, a hard frost usually will kill off the wasps, the hornets, and the yellow jackets. In the last 3 years, we have not had hard frost until late October or early November. And some of us are convinced that the next generation of these insects are being born before the spring. And they're coming out looking for food. And when they don't find flowers, pollen, and nectar, and other smaller insects to go after, they go after the honeybees. And 2 years ago, we had a pollinator festival in the fall at Drumlin. And I was supposed to do a hive opening. I had about 40 people surrounding me in front of one of our hives. And I opened it up and I had to quickly close it up because the yellow jackets had invaded it and wiped my hive out. Wasps, yellow jackets, and hornets are meat eaters. And if they can't find other food, they're going to go after the bees. So we're now having to basically put up yellow jacket wasp traps earlier in the season to deal with this problem. But that's just one of the smaller effects of climate change, and it's a big problem. This just goes through that. This is just some of the plants out at Drumlin. The sunflowers this year are particularly beautiful. Honeybees in New England and in America in general on this continent live in either trees if they're feral, or they live in hives that beekeepers produce. The weather's not really open to allowing them to basically create their hives outside as they do in parts of South America, Africa, and the Middle East. You will often find honeycomb just on a tree in those countries because it's so warm. Well, this is one of our hives had absconded. They weren't happy with the location, and they went into the woods. And this is an oak tree that had an opening in it that was with a basically big cavity. And the bees found it, which is what feral bees do. In the wild, that's what they will do. And then it got so hot, they started building on the outside of the hive, of the tree. And what you're looking at is 7 or 8 layers of honeycomb covered with bees. This is it later in the season when it started to get cold, and the bees either went back in the tree or it died off. But you can see the many layers of comb. But they just can't survive in our winter climate with this, unless we lose winter totally, which I don't think will happen. Native bees, again, are having as much problems, if not more, and they're just disappearing. This is a study that was done about bumblebees. I don't know how many people really realize that honeybees don't pollinate tomatoes. Tomato flowers, as most of you probably know better than I, are a very tight flower. And a honeybee can't get inside of it. So it can't get the pollen and it can't get the nectar. Bumblebees are what they call a buzz pollinator. They attach themselves to that flower and they buzz. You all have heard bumblebees buzzing around the garden, and that buzzing vibrates that plant and opens it up, that flower up, and pollinates it. So without the bumblebees, our tomato crops will decrease. And again, there are already a number of the different types of bumblebees that have been put on the endangered species list, and some of the types have already disappeared. So how can we protect our pollinators? We need to make an environment that's available to them that has more forage and safe for the honeybees. We need to stop cutting down the forests. We need to redevelop the forests. We need to do diverse agricultural systems and vegetation, as most small farmers and you guys at NOFA do. We need to either use pesticides, fungicides, or herbicides that are more organic and less harmful, or stop using them at all. Drumlin doesn't use any of these. They do all natural approaches, and we don't do any chemicals on any of the bees. We're doing all natural approaches, some of which we've been developing and working on. There's one of the ladies covered in pollen. You know, I call it the drunk bee because she's so covered in pollen. And again, she goes from flower to flower, and some of that pollen falls off and inseminates the plants so that they'll create fruits and vegetables.
Mel, there's a question about the pesticides' effects on the pollinators and whether pesticides are making it harder for bees to find their way back to their hives, if that's one of the ways that it affects them.
Colony collapse, which everybody's heard about, not many people talk about that much anymore. It really affects more of the big commercial beekeepers because they move their hives around the country to these large farms that use a lot of the pesticides and fungicides and herbicides. And that gets into the soil and it gets into the plant. And when the bees take the pollen and the nectar, they're ingesting it. Harvard Public Health, I think it's now 3 years ago, did a major study when colony collapse first really hit the market, so to speak. And what they found, in effect, is all of these chemicals are causing the bees to get dementia. And so they fly out, as the question raises, and they can't find their way back to the hive. And so when these big commercial beekeepers go to their bee yards, they open their hives and there's no one home. And it's because the bees just can't find their way anymore. It kind of ruins bees kind of have an internal GPS that they use the location of the sun to locate where their home is. And these chemicals are kind of messing up that internal GPS. So it's causing a big problem. So that's why it's better to get these things out of there. There are more parasites and pathogens and predators that are causing problems, and the warmer weather is increasing the numbers. We need to increase the nectar and pollen sources and the diversity of those sources. Again, these big monocrop farms, you know, would you eat one thing all the time, every day? There's just not enough diversity for the bees. And what happened 4 years ago out in the almond crops out in kind of mid-California where they all are totally dependent on honeybees. And they bring in, I don't know, 30, 40,000 hives to pollinate those areas. And some of those farmers are not really that cooperative. They don't wait for the bees to to be removed after they've pollinated, and they go in and do their spraying of whatever it is they're spraying on the flowers. And in one case, they killed 10,000 hives. You know, and there's a reason why the number of commercial beekeepers is decreasing, because they just can't make it work anymore. We need to do, again, research on more pollen and nectar sources. We need different types of techniques and equipment for beekeeping. And we need to bring more people into the beekeeping economy. We need to get more young people and interested, because commercial beekeepers in the past have made a decent living, but it's getting harder and harder, and they're not
Mel, I
getting...
have a related question to that, actually, if you don't mind if I interject once more.
That's fine.
Susan was wondering, does anyone else besides beekeepers take care of bees? Like, she was wondering veterinarians, entomologists, agricultural extension agencies. I think this is related to this issue about research. And so she also wants to know what you do when you have a problem with your bees.
So most of the extension services in Massachusetts, out at UMass, they do a lot of work on the bees. They have a research apiary there, and they have one up on the North Shore at one of the Voctech schools. So they do a lot of education and studies and putting that information out. When I have problems with my bees, I basically now have learned how to analyze my bees myself. The MDAR, which I think everybody knows is Mass Department of Agriculture, along with the Extension Service out at UMass, have run a number of really useful courses for beekeepers, whether they're commercial beekeepers. I don't really consider myself a commercial beekeeper. I consider myself a hobbyist beekeeper that's kind of running a bigger program, but they'll run a lot of programs to help them learn about better techniques. And they're teaching stuff. They ran a microscopy course where they taught people how to dissect bees and do some of the testing for some of the diseases that the bees are having. Unfortunately, under the present administration, the feds have some research centers, but their funding has been drastically cut. You used to be able to send dead bees for analysis to these labs. Right now you can't because they're not funded. So some of us have taught ourselves how to do it, so we don't have to go to them. I also help out a group of researchers at Harvard, one of the Harvard Research Institutes, who were studying the impacts of a certain chemical on bees and pollinators. They took our bee school class out at Drumlin, and so one of their people will do detailed analysis for me on my bees to let me know about viral counts, things like that. So there is some stuff going on, but it's harder. We really encourage the more hobbyist beekeepers out there, people who have 1 to maybe 5 or 6 hives, the better. Most of the county groups in Massachusetts run bee schools. We run a bee school out at Drumlin. We have averaged 40 to 45 people every year for the last 5 years. So more people are getting interested. More people are starting to understand how climate change is affecting and how the loss of bees will affect us in the long run. More people are doing vegetable gardens because of the pandemic. I hate to say a positive thing about the pandemic, but there are more people doing their own planting. And we go around talking about how just people in their gardens should stop doing certain things that are affecting how it impacts the bees and the other pollinators. Stop using chemicals, stop planting grass, plant clover or plant a garden. Grass takes a lot of work, a lot of water. and a lot of fertilizers. Clover doesn't. Clover doesn't take a lot of work. I think it's prettier, provides a great source of food for the bees and other pollinators. Dandelions do the same thing. We try to get people, when we talk to kids, we say, go home and tell your parents, stop pulling those dandelions and squirting that insecticide or that killer on them. So there, there are a lot of things you can do. Okay. This is just some views of Drumlin Farm and the diversity of the farm. And that's the point I'm trying to get, is that more diversity, the better. So besides food crops, they're also doing flowers. Their CSA does, fruits and not fruits, but vegetables and flowers. I'm amazed at the amount of stuff this place produces with only a few paid workers, and they use a lot of volunteers because of who it is. We need to raise more awareness in the community. More people need to get out there and talk to people about honeybees and beekeeping. And education. I mean, I go to a lot of schools and give talks on the bees and other pollinators. And more seminars. I mean, NOFA is a perfect place. As you said, I've done a number of talks trying to get more people interested in beekeeping. I'm convinced that small-scale farmers really should start a small-scale beekeeping program. It doesn't take a lot of money. And I guarantee you that your production on the farm will increase, and you'll have an additional profit center of having honey to sell. I'll give you an example. We produce a lot of honey out at Drumlin, and Mass Audubon raises a lot of money from the sale of the honey for their programs. So it just gives it pays for itself plus brings in additional money. So I talk about that all the time at places, getting people trying to do it. These are some of my helpers. Turkeys, for some reason, the wild turkeys always appear when I'm out there at the hives, though they don't bother the hives, luckily. We need to get the government to pass more regulations about protecting honeybees. The states under the Obama administration were required to create policies to protect honeybees and or a pollinator. I forget what it's called. Unfortunately, Massachusetts has not passed a law yet. A year ago, it wouldn't come out of committee. This year, it came out of committee with a positive vote by a majority, some of the laws that were being proposed. And as happens in Washington, it happens here too. The head of the Senate would not put it on the floor for a vote. And it's all about money. It's all about the pesticide industry, the insecticide industry, and the big farmers who are trying to, don't want to change the way they do things. Again, we need to support more training classes. And help smaller scale beekeepers set up organizations to jointly work together. Massachusetts has a really good setup where every county has a beekeeping association, plus there's an overriding group called Mass Bee, which is a state group that includes all of them, that does a lot of education and programs during the year. And we need to come up with ways to help medium-sized beekeepers really get credit for doing what they're doing, financial credit. Here's one of the girls on a flower, just sucking it up. And we need to change the perception of farmers about the beekeepers. There's a lot of work going on around the world. Most other countries in the world have banned some of these neonicotide-based insecticides and pesticides. We have not. And we just need to change the administration for a lot of reasons. I won't get into politics too much yet. I do talk about it soon. This is just more views of drumlin showing the diversity. But we all need to wake up and do something now before it's too late. This is what we're going to end up with. We're going to be in major trouble. Farms are going to close and die off unless we change what we're doing out there. Again, we need to restore and connect habitats. That's what I was trying to say earlier about pollinator paths. And we need to make sure there's a diversity of flowering so that this issue of phenology stops being an issue. I mean, it's taken millions of years for plants and pollinators to synchronize, and we've kind of thrown that synchronization off in only a matter of a few years, and we need to be able to recreate that. We need to create more nesting habitats for native bees. People need to stop clearing up all the fallen leaves in the fall and leave some of them out there, because a lot of the native bees, that's where they nest. And when you remove them all, they have nowhere to nest. So they're losing habitat themselves. And again, reduce the pesticide usage. And we want to increase the genetic diversity of bees. There's a lot of research going on to really breed bees that are more resistant to some of the problems. Most bees in this region are coming up from down south. People, when you buy bees, you get a 3-pound package. Majority coming from down south or out west. There are some of us who want to start breeding programs up here. We had hoped to start a queen raising program, a locally raised queen program here, which will help increase the diversity and the genetic traits of the bees to be more geared to our area. Unfortunately, one of the negative things about the pandemic for us is that kind of put a hold on our creating this program. Drumlin Farm was closed to the public and to most people up until summer camp season, when they opened up during the week for a reduced camp program, trying to maintain social distance and everything. And now they're only opening up on weekends for the general public, but you need to make reservations. I was able to go out there to take care of the bees. It's very weird to be at a place that's always full of people enjoying the animals and the farm, where there's nobody but a few of us. But I'm sure everybody else has kind of felt that. Here's one of the girls. We need to start planting more variety of plants for the early spring and into the late fall. And we need to do native plants for the region. Reduce the pesticide use. And if you do it at night when the pollinators aren't out. Used to be when, the state's doing a lot of spraying for EEE with mosquitoes. Used to be able to get your property excluded from that, you had to file with the local town hall public health by a certain date with a certified letter. One of the things the bee people in the MDAR in the state of Massachusetts have done is you now can file anytime during the year an online form with them, and that in theory will prevent these sprayers from coming near your property. They also are sending out alerts when there is spraying and where it is, so that those of us who are connected in the bee community can let everybody know, and so people can basically do some mitigation effects to help prevent that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Here are more of the girls. And again, as the person asked about, the Zero Cyst Society does create a flower mix for New England and other regions. One of the bee suppliers, and it's in the handout, Better Bee carries it. They're really good. I already talked about basically doing away with grass lawn areas, planting more wildflowers. With your kids, make seed bombs and with clay and wildflower seeds and drive around and toss them into empty lots. And people need to start educating their neighbors about what's going on and how to help the native bees and the other pollinators. And for the farmers out there, the Xerces Society runs a program called Be Better Certified Farmer. You can go online and look it up, and they have certain requirements, but they also provide help. And it's they're a great organization. They produce a lot of good materials, and they do a lot of good work. And we need to rise up and raise our voices. This talk was originally put together for a high school group. So there's talks about some of the things. There's one of the pollinators. As some of us who are older really got active in against the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, the youth of today are needing to get up and raise their voices, because climate change is going to impact them more than some of us, because we're not going to be here. And if they want a world that works, they really need to start making that move. Drumlin runs Youth Leaders for Climate Justice, where they bring in teenage groups from all over, and run conferences and workshops, and they're going around doing things. This summer, unfortunately, it's not really doing a lot. But the more people who get involved, the more schools that get involved, the better. And in the handout, there's a whole thing about that, since we want to have some time for questions. And they held conferences, workshops, and are really starting to do advocacy work, pushing for climate change. Everybody knows about Greta Thunberg, what she does, and she's really started a worldwide movement, which is great. There are a lot of school kids around the world that are really pushing. I mean, because that's where it's going to come from. All us old people have kind of lost our way to a certain extent. This is a climate strike by youth in San Francisco, more of the girls. And then there's a source list that's in that package that really goes through a lot of the possible things you can do, and look up and get more detailed information. And I think the list in the handout is even much longer. There's also web links to all of the beekeeping associations in Massachusetts, in the region, I believe, if I remember correctly, to get more information and to get involved. Every beekeeping group in the state runs bee schools, and they run mentorship programs where those of us who have been doing it for a while will go out and help new beekeepers, and they'll teach you how to do it. The more hobbyist beekeepers and backyard beekeepers, the better. Most towns allow it. Some towns have gotten a little snippety about beekeeping, and it's really an education thing. This is a poster put out by, or a drawing done by this guy who I call the godfather of mushrooms, Paul Stamets, which some of you probably heard about. Some of the research work I'm doing is based on his work, along with an entomologist from Washington State U, where he walked in his backyard one day and he has a lot of mushrooms and fungus growing. There was, rainwater had collected, and some of the things that are in those mushrooms and fungus were leaching out, and the bees were all over it. And so they started some research to test what was happening. And they discovered that the mushroom mixture was kind of reducing the viral loads that bees sometimes have because of these mite problems that they have. Mites are like very similar to ticks. They carry a lot of viruses, and they feed on the bees' fat in their bodies, but they also then inflict these viruses. Treating with these mushroom mixtures, and I brew a tea out of certain types of mushrooms, has reduced the viral loads to virtually zero. And we have had a lot more luck with getting our bees through the winters up here. Cold weather will not kill your bees. It's moisture in your hives that if you not have them set up properly, which will kill them. So it doesn't matter how cold it is, the bees are going to survive. But these mites and these viruses have caused major losses in the region. The last couple of years, the losses have ranged anywhere from 50 to 60%. We only lost 20% last year at Drumlin because of some of this work we're doing with the mushrooms. And I also work with rhubarb leaves. Rhubarb leaves are poisonous, as probably farmers know. So you cut them off and throw them away. I would suggest you save them and find beekeepers who will use them. And we place them in the hive and the bees chew through it and they release the natural oxalic acid that's in them, which knocks the mites off and has helped reduce mite loads in the hives to virtually zero, which is a positive thing. So I think that's it for the presentation. So I will stop the screen share, I believe. Hopefully.
That was great,
there we
Mel.
go.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm open to questions. I mean, the handout is really, if you can download the handouts, I would suggest you take them. There's a lot of good information and there are a lot of good resources in there.
Awesome. So I have a few questions queued up for you, Mel, and then after I ask those, maybe we can invite people to come off mute and ask questions live. But first I wanted to just offer you the questions that have been dropped in the chat along the way. So there was a question about best flowers to grow in the garden for fall pollinators. The person asking the question mentioned that you talked about dandelions and clovers, and those seem like they're more early season flowers. So what are some of the best late season flowers to grow?
The New England-based wildflower mixes that a number of places now sell will really give you flowers that bloom from the beginning of the season all the way into October, November. And there are lists that are available that give you, what flowers are really good for the bees. If I think people can get my email, I believe, and I think in the handout my email is there. And if you have any specific questions or ask me or just send me an email and I will send you some of the lists that I have. I can't really rattle off some of the flowers off my head. I usually just recommend these wildflower mixes. Just because I know that you'll get stuff all season long. And a lot of them will continue year to year because they self-seed.
Awesome. Thank you. I know in my garden, New England aster is one of my favorite fall native flowers for pollinators. And you can get Native Plant Trust has two native wildflower nurseries, Nasami Farm and Garden in the Woods in Massachusetts. So there was a question about whether deadheading reduces available pollen, or is it actually better to deadhead because species of flowers that you deadhead and they regrow flowers. So what's your sort of cost-benefit analysis of deadheading versus not deadheading?
Deadheading helps the flower to rejuvenate or the plant to rejuvenate. Once they're ready to deadhead, there is no more pollen in them. The nectar's already been taken. So
right.
It's really keeps the survival of the plant, helps the survival of the plant versus anything for the pollinator. I mean, what's interesting about honeybees is it's not like they leave the hive and go everywhere. They have a scout that goes out and finds the first source, and then everybody goes to that and they clean that up, and then they move on to the next. Like in my yard where we used to live, we just moved. We had a peach tree and raspberries that bloomed relatively early, and they kind of cleaned out the peach tree, and then they cleaned out the raspberries, and then they moved on to the next thing in the neighborhood. So deadheading really helps the plant, as some of you gardeners know better than I do. But
awesome. I have a question for you, Mel. You know, we do a lot with tillage reduction at NOFA, and I'm wondering what you've heard about the effect of reducing tillage or gardeners reducing their double digging or rototilling and that impact on ground nesting native bees.
it basically helps them by not destroying as many. I mean, a lot of the native bees nest in the ground. Bumblebees will find ant colonies, old ant colonies, or other insect colonies that are not used, and that's where they'll nest, or they'll nest in piles of leaves. And a lot of the other native bees do the same thing. So the less you disturb the soil, the better.
I wanted to see if Sephra from Connecticut NOFA would want to come off mute for a minute and talk a little bit about the Connecticut NOFA Ecotype project. Sephra, you mentioned that in the comments, and it seems like a really important resource to point people to. Would you like to do that? I'm just sort of springing this on you, Sephra, sorry. We can't hear you if you're talking, Sephra. Okay, well, I will just point everybody to the comments. Sephra left a comment about the Connecticut NOFA Ecotype project, which is a really cool project for increasing availability of locally grown, regionally appropriate native plants. Would anyone else like to come off mute to ask a question? Oh, Sephra says their microphone is not working. Okay, sorry. Oh, someone is asking about what types of clover specifically would you recommend?
I particularly like white clover, but any of the clovers really work. I'm very colorblind, so the white is better for me. The bees like any of it. I mean, they'll be all over it. If you go out there now, because there's a lot of clover that's in bloom right now, you'll see bees all over it. So it doesn't really matter the color.
I guess as a farmer / gardener, market gardener myself, who really spends a lot of energy on my pollinators, I've noticed that, I agree with you, whatever the clover is, bees love it. It's really sort of more about how it's applied in terms of your garden or farm system. So for me, mammoth red clover is a great larger perennial clover for if you're going to have a bed in fallow for a year. And then yellow sweet clover is a biennial clover that forms a deep taproot. That's a nice tall one. Bees love that too, but for both of those, you really need your beds out of production for a little while. So crimson clover is what to apply if you need your cover crop to winter kill. And crimson clover will usually reliably winter kill in New England. So those are some great clover options for farms and gardens.
Hi everyone, it's Sephra.
Yay!
Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi Sephra.
Hi, I signed in on my phone. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Quickly, I put the link for the Ecotype project. So an Ecotype, I missed the beginning part, I'm sorry, I don't know if you went over it, but it just refers to, we wild collect with botanists the genetics of the native pollinator plants from our ecoregion. The EPA put out a wonderful map that shows ecological communities and habitats, and instead of looking at delineations by Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, it looks at those habitat mosaics. So we're connecting, we're collecting genetics and proliferating along ecological corridors, the right plants for the right place. So what we've been doing with our pollinator health initiative is working with botanists who wild collect selected seeds that will be covering each of those bloom times. And then we take 200 plugs and plant them on organic farms to amplify the seed, which we then give to nursery growers to make available to homeowners, landscapers, and then eventually municipalities. So it's a really exciting project that has all these great stakeholders and strategic partners. We'd love to be involved with anyone who's doing that work. So I put the link in there and my email as well. And would love to help give any more information about that, because yeah, we're all about putting the right plants in for our pollinators. So thanks for letting me share.
Great.
Mel, this is Lynn. I just have a good story. The other day we went walking in the park and there were signs everywhere and it said, please do not disturb the sweat mining bees. And I've never even heard of them, but they were everywhere, and there were all kinds of signs around, and it was like, they're good, they're pollinators, please leave them alone. And I was really glad to see that.
And they will land on you and drink your sweat.
Yeah, that's why they had a lot of signs up.
Good.
Thanks so much, Mel. That was a fantastic info-rich session. Thanks, Sephra, for hopping on to tell us about the Ecotype project. Go check it out. It's great. And we will see you for another session, I'm sure.